Greetings, friends, and welcome to a lesson that'll be marked down in history. Well, maybe. We'll see. It's going to have to be a good one, right? Well, you've probably listened to the story that I read about the Phoenicians, and maybe you even read into it a little bit more yourself. And hopefully you've had a chance to print out the history question charts. These ones are the color version, but there's also a black and white version too that'll be a bit easier on your printer. Let's just take another look at these again. We've got the one that is about the nature of the land with questions like, what was the terrain like? What type of climate was there? What kinds of flora and fauna were there? How and why did people come to live there? There's also one about the relationships within and between groups. There's also one about the spiritual and intellectual culture. And there's also a chart about the human activities. And each of these charts has questions related to that main topical question. So my question for you is, from that story, do you think we have some answers to these questions? Before you begin, let's get a little bit more prepared. We're definitely going to need a pencil or pen to write with, and also some pieces of paper to put on these charts. Now, you could use index cards that are trimmed down or even sticky notes. They're a little bit big, but what I was able to do was take a regular 8.5 by 11 piece of lined paper, and I folded it 3 times, or I folded it into thirds vertically, and then I also folded it into thirds horizontally, and then when I cut along those fold marks, I came up with all these beautiful little pieces of paper that will fit very nicely there. So, thinking about the story of the Phoenicians, let's see if we can answer some of these questions together. For example, starting on the chart about the nature of the land, the first question, what was the terrain like? Can you remember anything from the story about the Phoenicians that talks about what the terrain was like? Oh, yeah, that's right. The terrain was rocky and sandy. There were steep, craggy hills. So actually, I'm going to write that down. I'm going to write that in complete sentences, actually. The terrain was rocky and sandy. It was surrounded by steep, craggy hills. Yeah, if there's any other details, I could definitely put some more here. That next question, what type of climate was there? Well, that was actually, it was hard to see. It talked about how the terrain was rocky and sandy and dry, so I'm going to assume that the climate was dry as well. Doesn't sound like a lot of fun, but, to each his own. What kinds of flora and fauna were there? Now, flora and fauna are fancy words for plants and animals. And do you remember, did they talk about any of the plants or animals? Yeah, that's right. They did talk about how there were cedar trees growing there, and there was some grass growing in the land too. hmm It also talks about how and why did the people come to live there? Well, don't know if that answer was in there. So we don't really have something for that, but we have 3 of our answers so far. I'm going to put this chart over to the side, take a look at this next one, and see if I have any other answers. How did this group interact with other groups? Now you're saying, oh my goodness, the Phoenicians, they traded and traded and traded and traded, and well, that's our answer actually. The Phoenicians traded with other groups around the Mediterranean Sea. They did, and then the next question talks a little bit more about that. What did they trade among themselves? Did they trade with others? Did they barter? Well, they did quite a bit. They traded furniture, salt, dried fish, embroidered cloth, glass, and a special, pretty stinky purple dye. Now, I bet you can probably find more answers to these questions on these other charts from the story about the Phoenicians, but you can also use some other sources as well. A book like this about life in the ancient world would definitely help, or really any article or book about an ancient culture should be able to help you answer many of these questions. I have also put a couple more stories from that book, The Story of the World, on the drive for you to read to yourself and to try to use with these charts. What's really cool about these is that they sort of help to form a story. If I actually read these back, it almost sounds like a story. Let's see. Oh, once upon a time, in a place where the terrain was rocky and sandy, and surrounded by steep, craggy hills, and a dry climate. And there were tall cedar trees growing up to the sky, and sparse amounts of grass in this land. In this land lived the Phoenicians. And the Phoenicians were traders. They traded with other groups around the Mediterranean Sea. They traded furniture made from their trees. They traded salt, dried fish, embroidered cloth, even glass, and a really special purple dye made from stinky snails. And I could keep going if I had more answers to these questions. So I'm really excited to see what stories you might be able to tell about other ancient people. So do check out those stories on the drive, and also feel free to grab articles and books to help you create your own story about ancient cultures. Have fun, explorers!